Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to the weekly live chat. I'm so excited to be talking about circle-shaped fillers today, and I hope that wherever you are, whatever you're doing, that you've had some time to quilt, whether it was on the challenge or just for yourself. I know it's obviously my therapy because I like to do it and I just need that little bit of me time. Anyway, in this live chat, I'm going to answer some of your questions about the last tutorial I just put out about the circle shape fillers. I have been writing down questions from the type chat before we started, but if you're watching this live and you have a burning question, you can put it in the type chat because Jessica is here monitoring those and she'll give them to me at the end. And we kind of started this live chat as a way for people that were participating in the challenge to be able to ask their questions and kind of let me go into a little bit more detail into the tutorial. So I'm excited to kind of address all of that. First off, if you got the free quilting diagrams or the expanded resource, I just found out on the type chat that there is a mistake. There is a picture error, not a tragic mistake, but so what I'm going to do is I will fix that and I will put it where it needs to go. And then if you purchase the expanded PDFs, I'll make that one page. You could just switch it out and I'll make that just a free link. So check the link in the description box below. It'll take you directly to it. And I'll probably do that this evening. So nothing like getting onto the live chat and realizing you made a mistake in front of a lot of people, but you know, it's how it goes. Anyway, so be on the lookout for that. One other thing before we get going to it, if you need a pretty stack of fabric, I mean, I know all us quilters don't have enough fabric, but I did design a coordinating fabric collection that goes with the panel that we're quilting on, as well as a pillow panel. So if you want to check out those like kind of, you know, to give a little bit of a help to your fabric stash. There's a word that starts with S that I'm missing. Anyway, so we'll be working through that. Plus, I've got some pictures and lots of stuff to talk about. Plus, I'm sure you have lots of questions. So we are going to be getting right into it. So there's that beautiful fat quarter bundle, Westward. I gave it a different name than the challenge because it kind of stands on its own, but it definitely is inspired by the panel and the colors. And I just love the watermelon and the teal. Of course, I'm a teal sucker for teal anyway. All right, a couple questions before we get started. When I show the promotional pictures, that's actually a quilt that's already finished, obviously. And so there were some questions about how I finished that. So we're going to go into that detail real quick. So if you didn't get the panel, no worries. But if you did and you want to do some of the same things I did, this is how you can go about doing that. So the first thing I want to point out, let me see if I'm on the right picture. I need to be up here. On that panel, I used a little bit of echoing in the diamonds just to separate each of the fillers from each other. We know I love quilting things to death. That's always been my style. So if you want to do the same, you can do that. I only echoed 2 sides, or in the center, 3 sides, because I wanted to be able to transfer in and out of each diamond. So that was a question that came up too. How do I go from one diamond to the next? Well, I just get to one of those corners, travel along the edge, and get there. But I did take a quick second just to break it down into some diagrams, maybe make it a little bit easier to see. So this will kind of show you in those diamonds how I separated those, and you can see like that echoing. Again, the reason I didn't echo all the sides is because I want to use that little part that's not echoed to transfer in and out. And then in the white part on the left side of the panel, I did some dot-to-dot quilting just for funsies. You know, I love to do the opposite of what I've just done, so a little bit of dot-to-dot is a fun option. Of course, we're not going to be talking about that or learning that in the challenge, but if you wanted yours to look just like mine, you definitely can. Another thing I did is in the lighter side on the right, I did add some echo lines there. So I just kind of extended the line and added a 1/2-inch echo there as well. Just, again, to separate the fillers that we're going to be learning. You don't have to do that. And in fact, if you're watching the tutorials, you can tell that the quilt that I'm working on, I'm not doing that. So I'm quilting the same quilt again. But there were some questions about that. So in the video tutorial, the quilt that I'm quilting for you, you can see it's been stitched in all the seams, we'll say the fake seams, because that's just how I got it stabilized. Just to hold it in place, because I'm going to probably throw that up on the long arm too and quilt on both, and so it just helps me get it ready to go. If you want to do that, a light gray is going to be a good option, or you can match the thread color to the block. It's up to you. Normally, I would not do all the stitching in the ditch and then come back and fill it in, because I would quilt it as I go. But since I'm kind of bouncing back and forth, it just makes more sense for here. So if you're not worried about that, then just ignore that whole minute of talking, because you might like, I don't care. No worries. You don't have to get onto that. All right, so the Fillers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, you know that if you're here. It's a 5-video series where we're going to work through some of my favorite filler designs. And so this week we're talking about circle-shaped pebbles and building off of it. The one thing I didn't really get to drive home in the tutorial is that these variations that we're creating, you can do that with any design that you know and love. So you're going to see this a lot. You're going to hear about changing up the size, adding echoing, changing the shape, overlapping. I think it's so much easier to learn 5 different ways to quilt one design than it is to learn how to quilt 5 different designs. So these variations, I mean, really, I just picked my favorite and went with them. You can probably come up with 100 more. So I want you to feel inspired and kind of encouraged to come up with your own variations as well. If you see a design, you're like, I don't like it, I don't love anybody that much, I don't want to do it, then try to come up with your own variations that you will actually use. So I definitely want to leave you with that little bit of encouragement. All right, so when we started off with the pebbles. So that was our first kind of circle shape. And let's look at those. When we're talking about fillers, and in my last live chat, I went into a lot more detail about this, so I won't really drive this home, but when we look at what we put around something, what we fill around it, that's going to determine whether it's highlighted, whether we're hiding it, whether it's going to help draw attention to it or away from it. Pebbles are a very static design. They don't have any movement. They're just there. They're squishing down that area so that what you're putting it around will really pop out. So this is going to be something you put around something you want to show off. Now, as we look through the sample, we can see here's the example here where I quilted it. I'm trying to keep them all roughly the same size in this first variation because I want that overall texture. I don't necessarily want 1 or 2 pebbles to stand out from each other because I want that nice overall texture because it's filling in around whatever I'm showing off. But something in the video, there was a thing I mentioned. I said make it about a penny sized. I was trying to give some kind of frame of reference to the size you should quilt them, at least when you're starting out. When you're looking at your quilting designs, you can quilt any design, any size. It just depends on how much time you want to put into it, how much quilting you want on it, how dense you want it to be. It's totally up to you. I just know in a video, it's really difficult to get an idea of scale when you're looking at that screen. And the reason I suggest starting out with a penny size, if you're newer to quilting pebbles, is that I have noticed the more I teach, I still see this. Sometimes we try quilting them really small because that's how we see it on a lot of quilts. Well, that's great, but it's very difficult to think through your next step when you're quilting a really small pebble. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you're struggling with your pebbles, try making them about a penny size or bigger. Now, if you're like, hold up, Angela, I know what I'm doing, then do what you're doing. Don't change it on my account. But if you're struggling, that could maybe be partially why. So the penny thing is a loose guide. I should have maybe reiterated that, but basically if you're struggling, they don't have to be tiny. And that was a question that came up in the type chat because I get on the video about half an hour before we go live and I type and answer questions and find out if there's mistakes in my handouts. The question was like, is that a literal thing? It's not, it's just a guide for you. And somebody said also, I don't want to quilt things so densely, so I don't know if I'm going to participate in the challenge. You can change the scale of any design. You just spread out the spacing between the lines or you shrink it down. So in the challenges, of course, I'm quilting it small because that's how I like to do it. That's my handwriting style, right? It's hard for me to write bigger or quilt bigger, so that's how I do it. But you can definitely take any of these designs if you want and spread them out, make them bigger. In fact, we see some variations of this in a second. All right, I'll stop preaching, but it's important to note. I gave a couple tips in the video. The most important thing though is you want to change direction. So clockwise to counterclockwise. This is straight out of the expanded resource PDF. I just took a screenshot of part of that. It's that change in direction that is going to help them stick together. There's some other things that will help you be happy with your pebbles, but that's the #1 tip if you only remember that. Because if you don't, you're just going to get something that looks like loops, and that's fine. But if you want them to stick together like pebbles, this is going to be the way to go. So you might think clockwise, counterclockwise, or for those of you in overseas, clockwise, anti-clockwise. However you say it, we just want to go in opposite direction. But how I kind of think of it, and this is going to be weird, but you guys know me, so you won't judge me. If I quilt my first circle, I'm going to quilt my next one so that it goes away from it. right? So if it went, go away. That's how I thought about it, but however you do think about it, you want to change that direction. And I promise, the more you do it, the easier it gets. So don't feel like you tried it for a little bit and it just didn't work. All right, so where are we going to use this? I have a lot of examples of pebbles on quilts, but I'm going to start off by saying they can be very tedious for me. I know myself, I don't like quilting lots of pebbles. Even that much you see on that picture that I did for Tula Pink, that was a lot. I was just like, oh, I'm so bored. I've got to like break up the quilting because I just get so bored. I don't know. I don't love them, so I use them in little bits. So I am probably not going to put pebbles over a whole quilt. First of all, like if you do that, then you're not going to get any emphasis because there's nothing there around. And second of all, it just would be boring. The only alternative to that is if you're practicing. If you want to get better at quilting pebbles, well, shoot, if you do them over a whole quilt, I guarantee you'll be a professional by the time you're done. So I save my pebbles for smaller areas, smallish areas, and in tonal fabrics where you can see the quilting. I am very strict about my return on my quilting time investment. If you can't see the quilting because the fabric is busy or the thread blends in really, really well, then I'm going to do something that's a little bit quicker. And knowing which designs I can quilt quicker or not so quick is going to help me be more intentional about the choice that I make. So those are how I pick the shapes that I'm using in. But again, you're gonna play around with this. You're gonna find what you like, and every quilter is different. That's what makes teaching these tutorials so much fun. But again, around motifs, around things that I want to stand out, and I'm going to use it in smallish areas, solid fabrics, and I'm also going to use a thread color that blends. I don't think I really stressed that in the video tutorial. For this, it's all about the texture, and it was great because on the Facebook group, somebody posted a picture of like contrasting thread and blending thread. If your pebbles look great with contrasting thread, they're going to look perfect in matching thread. A blending thread color covers a multitude of quilting sins, and you just see that overall texture. I mean, even if you're looking at this picture, you can't really see where the pebbles are. I mean, I'm not going to point out my mistakes to you, but you do get that nice, flat overall texture. So again, you know, when we talk about using fillers, we can fill around blocks, we can fill around motifs, we can also put them within quilting designs. Now this is getting a little like crazy, right? It's like I'm gonna fill in the fillers that go around the blocks, but I can sprinkle them in areas to make parts of my quilting design pop. So this is just an extreme close-up on some ribbon candy with some little bitty pebbles in there. Again, that's about how many I can quilt until I'm just bored out of my mind. But it's gonna make those lines really pop. And so be very intentional about where you place them because they're gonna make whatever you put them by really show. And you know, sometimes we wanna make sure that it shows off the things that we want to show. Another example of just using those pebbles interspersed with quilting designs. I know this is showing off a little bit because this is very dense quilting, but you kind of get the idea, right? I can use them with other designs, and next week we're going to talk about combining designs, but I can really use those pebbles in little areas to make things pop. So don't feel like you have to do it over the whole quilt, and definitely don't feel like you have to make them all perfect. All right, I'm going to switch real quick to my overhead camera. I'm like switching all over the place. So here is the westward panel that I put together. This little pillow panel is about 20 inches, and some people were quilting on this because it's a smaller alternative to the bigger panel. So if you don't want to do a bigger project, if you don't want to put your panel on the long arm until after we're all done, this is a great option. And so if you wanted to quilt along, you can put your pebbles and your bubbles in one of the colors, and then next time come back and do a different design in the white. Now here I'm doing some dot-to-dot quilting because, well, we know I get bored doing pebbles. So this is a great option here to play around with your different fillers and then try them out. So now we'll go back to the photos. So anyway, pebbles, a question that came up that was really, really great is what about on the long arm? Is there a stitching mode that's better? Well, you know what I'm going to say, right? It depends. I would say, for me, I like to work in manual mode when quilting on my long arm. And if you don't have a long arm, just tune me out for about 30 seconds. Manual mode means I'm pushing that button and it's going. So if I move the machine slower or faster, it's not going to change the speed of the machine or the stitching, so my stitches will be organic. There'll be some smaller and some wider. I love to quilt, well, let's just pause and say I only quilt in manual mode when I'm quilting just quilts because that's just how I learned. I didn't have a stitch regulator when I started, But I love how you can get a more fluid movement down in the manual mode. So if you are trying on a long arm and you're getting more rock-shaped pebbles, they're more square, that's fine. But if you want them more round, maybe try the different stitching mode. But there is also a downside. I have got to know my design because I can't just hesitate because it's going to still stitch. So make sure you know the design before you try going to manual mode, but you might find that a little bit easier. Stitch regulated mode means that as I move the machine quicker and slower, the motor is going to rev up and slow down so that the stitches are all the same length. That's great for those that are trying to learn a new design, those of you that really want your stitches to be the same length. But I feel like I'm kind of pushing the machine. I'm kind of like not getting that fluid momentum. And this is going to sound so weird, but I love the sound of manual. So play around with both stitching lines and find what works for you, because you might find that one of those works better than the other. All right, before we move on to Pebbles, question was, what about the foot I'm quilting with on my sewing machine? So you might notice in the video tutorial, I'm using a ruler foot. It's a high profile free motion quilting foot. And that's because I love to pull in my ruler and then go right back to not using it. So I quilt with that almost exclusively. Any free motion quilting foot you have will be perfect. However, I would encourage you, if you have one that's round, will be great, because as we get into echoing, especially next week with the swirls, having the same distance between the needle and the front of your foot and the sides of your foot will help you get those consistent echoes. So it doesn't matter what side, but you can definitely play around with that. All right, next we did bubbles, and somebody asked on the Facebook group, what's the difference between bubbles and pebbles? I just trying to come up with a different name. That's it. They're just different size pebbles. And this is a great option. Changing up the size of your design, especially when you mix it together, is going to give you a softer texture, and it's going to be quicker to quilt. And you know, let's be honest, sometimes that's what we're going for. So with bubbles, what we're doing is we're intentionally quilting bigger ones and little ones. But if you could think of any one point or remember only one thing, remember this: I want there to be enough difference between those circles that it looks intentional. I don't want it to look like I'm trying to quilt them all the same size but failing. So with this, I'm thinking coins, you know, and I know not everybody uses American coins, but whatever coins you have or whatever you have in real life that you can use as a visual reminder. And another tip I gave in the video, you want to quilt your bigger ones first and then fill in around it with the smaller ones. So you're going to put the bigger things in first. It's like the important things in life, right? I love to do this in any fabric. Here, this is a solid quilt or solid fabric kind of quilt, just a nice soft texture. It's going to quilt a lot faster. So for those of you that want a less dense option to your pebbles, those of you that want to get this quilt finally frickin' finished, that's going to be a good option. Or if you're working on something that you want to look like bubbles or you know, water, it can kind of look like any of that kind of stuff. The trickier part about this is as you're working with your bigger circles, now we're traveling along a bigger line than the smaller ones. So I try, when possible, to quilt my big ones and then use the traveling around the little ones to do. But just get it as close as you can and know that when you're done, it's going to look fine. All right, so this is another example we've seen a couple times. Another example of changing up the size just for fun, making it go a little bit quicker, knowing that I could have quilted tiny pebbles, but really, I mean, I still get the same effect and it's a lot quicker. One little thing I'm going to show you real quick as I pull this off, I actually have the quilt right here. When you're quilting pebbles, I know it's kind of hard to see, but when you're quilting bubbles that are different sizes, as you get up close to areas, you might find that there's just not enough room to fit the big ones in. And that's fine. You can just quilt little ones. But one thing that I did a little different is I'll quilt partial bubbles. Maybe I won't quilt the whole thing. I'll make it look like it's going behind something. That's going to help me fit those bigger circles in smaller areas. So you don't have to quilt the whole thing. You can kind of quilt part of it so you still get that less dense quilting. What can tend to happen sometimes is as we start quilting, we can start like quilting all different sizes, but as we get close to stuff, they all get small, and that's fine. But what's that going to do? That's going to draw attention directly to what you're doing that by. That change of scale is going to draw attention to it. So that's fine if that's what you want, but if you don't want that, then that's a way you can get around it. See, questions you didn't even ask. All right. I showed in the video tutorial how you can intersperse, like change it up within the design, and that's a great option. Or you can be more intentional about it. So this particular quilt, and I know I showed this in the video, but it's just worth talking through. You can quilt them where they go from smaller to bigger, either from top to bottom, from side to side, or they could be smaller around an element and get bigger as you go out. So there's a lot you can do with that scale to change it up and give it a different effect. It's also great for those of you that are struggling with keeping all your pebbles the same size. Now here's the bad news. Those of you that already know how to quilt pebbles, you might find overlapping pebbles a little difficult. Some of you might be like, shoot, I already do that. I'm way ahead of the curve. I think what's fun about quilting designs is even if it's a mistake, as long as you do it all the time, it's going to look intentional. And I just think that's what's great about this. No other area is that the case, right? I can't mess stuff up in surgery and hope it works out, but definitely in quilting. Now, overlapping pebbles is one of those designs that you're probably not going to use as much. It's not going to be as versatile as your classic pebbles, but it is going to give your quilting a fun, different texture. And it might be a nice alternative for you if you're struggling with getting your pebbles close to each other. You might be like, I'm just trying to really get the circle down. I don't want to worry about trying to make them, kind of nestle up to each other. But just like we saw with the changing of size, whatever we do, we just want it to look intentional, right? So make sure that if you overlap by enough that it looks like you mean to. When it comes to quilting this design, or really any design, I cannot stress this enough. You need to find what you like. You are the expert of your opinion. However, I'm the expert of my opinion, and in my opinion, I don't like to overlap every single pebble because it can look messy, and I don't want it to look messy. And I'll start with bigger pebbles as well. So we're not doing teeny tiny pebbles and overlapping them. You'll just drive yourself nuts, and you'll hate me, and I don't want you to hate me. So I usually do, this is so silly, 1, 2, 3, overlap. 1, 2, 3, overlap. I kind of talk to myself. So again, you can play around with that and figure out what you like. This is going to be for your more, it could go on any fabric, tonal, busy, because it's pretty quick how it goes together. But especially if you have a pictorial, like a picture panel or something that looks like raindrops falling on the ground. That was a quilt for somebody that said this is supposed to resemble raindrops, and I'm like, oh, I'll just do overlapping pebbles. But it can look like bubbles, it can look like water, or just that different, and I know I said this so many times in the video, a pop of texture. Trust me, I edited out a bunch too, so I just love the word texture. But if you are doing, big pebbles over the whole thing and you have some overlapping around a block, that's going to draw attention to it. Or if you have squares and you quilt the big bubbles over everything, but in your favorite fabric, you do them overlapping, just that pop of texture is going to draw attention. So using it kind of intermittently and through there. But again, don't try to do this with teeny ones. You'll just drive yourself nuts. All right, so echoing your pebbles. I was surprised it made me that long till I said echoing. I love echoing. In next week's video, we're going to hear echoing a lot. But echoing is a great way to highlight your shape. It's another fun way to give your quilting a different look and really kind of just have a different texture. Again, I got to look up a thesaurus and get some better words. But what we're doing here is we're just quilting our circle and then echoing inside of it. So it's a little different because normally we echo on the outside, but this time we're going to echo on the inside. Although in the expanded PDFs, I show you how you can do both. If you're going to echo, you know what I'm going to say, right? You just want to make sure there's enough difference in that spacing so it looks intentional. You don't want it so close because it'll just look like you tried to travel and missed it. And I'm not going to echo every pebble. So this is going to be, again, something that I put in an area that I want to draw attention, especially if I'm doing circles over the whole thing. It looks like olives. So if you're doing a martini quilt, I don't know, maybe you are. That would be a good option. And what happens is instead of seeing that unquilted area in the center, you kind of have the two, you have this littler one and then that space in between. So it just kind of gives you a different look. So again, not one you're going to use a lot, but echoing is definitely a way to really highlight it. And then lastly, we changed the shape and we did ovals. How'd you all like that? Ovals are so much fun to quilt. They look great. They look different than pebbles, but there's one more thing to think about, and that's direction. So it's kind of like once I've gotten used to quilting pebbles, I haven't get in that Zen mode, and then I go to ovals. It just takes me a second to get my mind back where I'm going. But ovals are great because they're going to look totally different than circles, not totally, but different than circles. And I love them in landscape quilts. If you've ever done a house quilt, perfect. Shingles, pathways, just a different texture, especially if you're doing a landscape quilt and you're just tired of doing the same pebbles over everything. It's a great option. Now, real quick, I'm going to go back to my overhead. When we look at the sample here, so this is just a bunch of the circles quilted together. The first thing I want to point out is since all these designs are built off the same shape, they work together really nicely. So I went from one to the next and on and on. And so this could be a good fun practice piece for you, or practice thing if you'd like. But when we get to our ovals, what tends to happen is we get weird gaps in between them. This is normal. Instead of trying to fit teeny tiny pebbles, I'm going to use pebbles or circles, and we kind of saw that in the video tutorial. So don't be afraid to throw those circles in and fill in any of those gaps, because that's going to help make it nice and consistent texture. And you might think, well, isn't that small circle going to stand out? Well, yeah, but if you do it more than once, then it looks intentional. Don't overthink how many horizontal versus how many vertical. Don't make it harder than it is. Just quilt what you want. And then here I didn't talk about this in the video, but you can go on the angle if you want to. That's another thing to think about, because they get harder to fit together. But if you want to, you can kind of play with some positioning and come up with some fun effects. And if you wanted to make that placement more regulated, where you had a certain number go in each direction, it can really create a really cool secondary design. But again, not for every quilt, but it's a great option if you want to try it. So those were what we talked through. Hopefully the little tips will help you out with that. A question I had, and then I'll answer any questions that Jessica might have wrote down. One question was such a great question. I haven't really been asked this before. When I'm quilting, or I think she said storing, when I'm not quilting, do I leave my needle in the up or down position? And this is one of those things I have to say, it depends on what you want. So I'll tell you what I do, and then you do what you want to do. I always leave my needle down. Especially, well, I always, even on my long arm, because if I leave my long arm on most of the time, not how you're supposed to do it, but that way I can hop on there real quick and quilt a little bit more. But I always leave it down just so it holds that quilt in place. What can happen though, especially on your sewing machine, if you're quilting and you stop and you leave your needle down and your quilt then kind of just falls, like is hanging down, when you go to quilt next time and that needle comes up, your quilt might move a little bit and you'll have that first big stitch. So that's the only drawback. I'm sure there's other things that are drawbacks, but that's just how I do it. But again, that's just my preferences. So I did a lot of talking about circles. Somebody commented, I make it look so easy. Well, if you watched a video and I made it look hard, you wouldn't want to do it, right? So it is easy once you get the hang of it. Can I use glide thread in the bobbin? Yes, you can. Be careful when you're winding it. With any bobbin, you want to make sure that it's wound tightly and consistently. If your bobbin is squishy or it's not wound evenly, then that's not going to quilt well. You're going to drive yourself nuts. So you can, but you might have to wind a little slower and just make sure it winds tightly. Do I tighten my stitch length on Pebbles? Great question there. I didn't talk about that. It depends on the size that you're working on. If you think of a circle, it's a bunch of little segments, little straight segments. So if I have a big stitch length and a little pebble, I'm going to get almost what looks like an octagon or a multi-sided polygon. So if you are having trouble getting that round a little bit, you can up the stitches per inch. Now, just know that if you put a lot of stitches per inch and you have to rip it out, that's going to be not fun. But I would say usually when I'm quilting, 10 to 12 stitches per inch is what I work with. And if I were going to do some really tiny pebbles and I really want to get those tight circles, I might go to 13. I probably wouldn't go much more than that, but that's up to you. Is it okay to use different thread colors in the different colors of thread in the bobbin? Is it okay to use different colors of thread in the bobbin? Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Now I know sometimes being able to do whatever you want means I don't know what I want to do. You can definitely use different thread colors in the bobbin. I try to keep the thread in the bobbin the same value as the top in general. So if I have a dark blue on the top, I'll put a dark gray or something that's dark, and it will help hide any of those pokies. What we're trying to do with the same thread color or the same value is as I move around and stitch, if I get a part of a thread that comes up to the top, I'll be able to see it and it'll stick out. So that's the only reason why you hear some people say they use the same thread color in the bottom. I have a new Moxie. What is the best tension settings to use while doing pebbles? Okay, so tension is just referring to the two threads in tune with each other. And so you don't have to adjust your tension when you're doing pebbles. You would leave it the same no matter what design you're doing. Somebody did, as an aside, post a picture on the Facebook group and said my tension is really bad on my pebbles, and it was pretty drastic. That means there's a threading issue or there's some kind of issue there that's not necessarily tension. It's pretty drastic. If it's only giving you bad tension on the circles, it could be that you're moving maybe not quite smoothly enough or confidently enough. That will work itself out. But if the tension is bad all the time, then you'll have to make an adjustment. So hopefully that helps. I know that's kind of, tension isn't specific to the pebbles. It can be for any of them. But if you're asking like what stitch mode to use, like what stitching thing you should use, again, I would start with regulated, but you can go into manual. What color thread am I using in my bobbin? So this is where I'm like, I always do this, except when I'm filming and then I'm using a light gray pre-wound because when I'm filming, it's all about the time. So the tension on you can see little pokies on my back sometimes depending on where I quilt, but I'm using light gray, although I would suggest using, if you're gonna quilt with the challenge thread colors, go a little bit darker, like a medium gray if you wanna use just one thread color. Is basting with pins as good as using thread? Yes. It doesn't matter how you get your quilt sandwich together, just get those suckers basted together. The one benefit I would think to using pins to stabilize is that I can take a pin out whenever I get there. I feel like sometimes when I do thread basting or big stitches, if I take one stitch out, sometimes they keep unraveling and maybe I'm not ready for that then. So I would think basting with pins is just as good, and in my opinion, I prefer it over basting with thread. But again, y'all, you have to do what you think works for you. And how do you know if it works? You try it. If it doesn't work, well, now you know what not to do next time. So hopefully that's giving you a little bit of encouragement there. So as you're working throughout this week on the challenge, if you're quilting along with me, try out the Pebbles. And if you have any questions that I didn't address, leave them in the comments after the live is over. I get back on YouTube from time to time and just glance through the comments, try not to look too hard in case anybody's being too mean, but I can answer questions. Or you can join our Facebook group. There's a link in the bottom that takes you to all this stuff, and that's a great place to post your progress pictures, ask questions. Even if I can't get on there and answer, other people are great to help out too. So I hope you enjoy your circles. Now, next week, we're gonna see swirls. It's my favorite. I love swirls, and we're gonna be talking through several variations. And so as we embark on this challenge together, I want to encourage you to not be overwhelmed by the options, right? You're just gonna pick a few that you like, or if you're a sampler, you can try all of them. But just, if you don't love it, we're gonna come up with some ways to create different designs as you work through it. So if you're quilting along with me, I'm so excited. If you're not quilting live, no problem. The videos will always be on my YouTube channel whenever you want to take it up. So you can check out past challenges and have fun with that. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope everybody stays safe, has a great weekend, and we will be back on Tuesday with the next video in the Fillers Free Motion Challenge. Until then, everyone, happy quilting.